they were they were very they were very happy. Let's just say.
Yes, as my age has increased and my girth widened, I have become more selective in what I reenact. So my days of reenacting World War II soldiers, I think, are past. But medieval knights and Revolutionary War militia, I can get away with still.
Yeah, of course, Sergio is like much skinnier than me, so I had to wear the chainmail, for like literally medium to extra large. So it looked, damn. I don't think I could even be what is it called, legatus, but it did look like I was, definitely close to the, I don't know. Those were in shape too, so I can't really.
The Revolutionary War militia, I can get away with still.
Yeah, of course, Sergio is
1 second.
Like, it's much skinnier than me, so I had to wear the chainmail. Sorry, I'm just trying to meet. Okay. Okay. All right. So let me just go back to this. All right. Let me just admit everybody. Otherwise, there will be scrimmage. So let me admit everybody. Oh, he's Greg on. So I'll make him a co-host. Just coming in. Jeff, so we'll give a couple more minutes so people can kind of get together.
Absolutely.
30 people or so, but more coming in. Kind of like as people coming, there's a little music playing, so just to make it more. Greg is actually traveling in, believe it or not, in Europe right now.
Oh, wow.
So he's chilling, it's like, I tell him, Greg, are you joining? He's like, no, I'm in Chorch in Portugal. I'm like, okay, you man. While we're, so I'm making him a co-host now. Greg, where are you now? You home or you still in Chorch in Portugal? Haven't left?
No, I just came back yesterday, but I traveled in Europe for a month.
Fantastic.
And I've been to Spain, Portugal, and France, mostly, many places there.
Excellent. So let me just kind of like tell people. So what we always like to do, guys, today we're talking about politics, so 100-year war. How this came about is basically Sergio, who is also one of the co-founders of the group, had done an arms and armor in the 100-year war, and we didn't really dive into a lot of politics. And Greg helped out a little bit regarding the 100-year war politics, but now we brought in, so to speak, expert in politics or medieval, Europe, particularly England, and Andrew, is definitely had done many presentations for us already, and we are really thankful and always great turnout whenever he presents.
I wanted to ask Andrew, as I was traveling in France, I dug into this writer. It's not really a fiction. It's kind of like a historical fiction, but it's really history. I don't know if you're familiar with him, Maurice Druon.
No, I'm not, but I am intrigued, and we'll look him up now.
Oh, you should, because he is, he wrote 7 books, and the series called The Accursed Kings, and it's really following the last of the Capetings.
Oh, nice.
And the Valois, and they're starting, and that's exactly related to this, and it goes in details.
Absolutely.
I've learned a lot of interesting details, especially about the extramarital activities of Margaret of Burgundy and Blanca, and all of the sons of Philip IV.
Thank you. We'll get to discuss it. Let me just do the introduction. People joining, thank you for appreciate it. So today in the panel, we're going to have a couple of people, Greg, Rizak, and Ralph and people want, obviously want to ask a question, either of them or me can read the questions off the chat. So the way that we usually present questions is whenever you have a topic is either you can put it in the chat or you can directly ask, like just Greg just asked the question. And then we could actually unmute you and you can ask a question. You can just raise your hand. I don't know if you know how to raise a hand. It's right on the, tools. And then you can ask a question regarding that. Also, most importantly, what I wanted to do, I wanted to start this by doing a moment of silence for also one of our presenters' brother had just passed away. His name is Seth Hodges, and very sorry, obviously, our condolences. And if we could start this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off, because I used to, one second, I put in the, one second, let me just turn off the sound when people join, and then, and if we can start a moment of silence for a second. For Seth Hodges, who is the friend of our Jonathan Hodges, who is one of the presenters, and again, we're very sorry that he passed away and at this young age, and we send our condolences. So about 20 seconds. All right, thank you, everybody. And then without further ado, Andrew, you want to introduce yourself and then kind of like lay out how you want this to be conducted, and then I can start the recording as well.
Very good. So for those who I have not had the pleasure to speak to before, my name is Andrew Dangle. I'm a career educator and historian. Started off particularly in 19th century United States history, but later in my career moved into the medieval world. My particular specialty at this point is on the Angevin period. So you're looking at the reigns of Henry II through John in England. But I knew that there was a lot of interest in the 100 Years' War, and was approached and asked if I'd be willing to go into some details on the 100 Years' War. And I was a little hesitant at first because the scholarship, particularly on the military side, is very fast moving on the 100 Years' War in terms of arms and armor. The organization of British, English, and French armies changes quite a bit during the period, and I'm just not as up to date on that scholarship as I am on other things. However, the roots of the 100 Years' War come very much from the Angevin and earlier periods, and the interrelation between the English royal family and the French royal family. And so I said I'd be willing to dive into some of the political background and some of the political turmoil. And just like if you've heard, Jonathan and I presented on John of England, and I did some stuff on Richard I. When we look at the reigns of those kings and the interactions, the personalities of the rulers involved dramatically influences the events, political and military, that are going on. That is certainly the case of the 100 Years' War. The fortunes rising and falling for both sides during the period are largely based on which king is currently in power in which region and how much support, particularly in terms of resources, they can get for continuing the conflict. So that's sort of the focus that I hope to approach the period on. As far as questions or any of that kind of information, please feel free to ask at any time. Again, my career background is in education, and I always much rather preferred classrooms to be run as a conversation as much as one person just talking the whole time. So if you have any questions, ask. Fair warning, I am not able to just roll with the 100 Years' War like I can with earlier periods. This is the first presentation I'm doing for you that I actually have a stack of notes in front of me to help myself keep track. So if I don't know the answer to a question, I will certainly try to get back to you with that information at some other point, just because there's a whole lot to unpack in the 100 Years' War. And kind of, often I have sort of detailed background slides that I use when presenting, and I'm going to do less of that in this presentation. I've got a chart of the royal houses and how they're interconnected, which we'll bring up a little bit later, which may be useful. But in terms of visual information, there's just less of that I have sort of stored up for my own research for this period. The advantage of that is that it actually allows me to see the chat and see questions a little bit more easily, so we can run from there. So to start with, looking at the 100 Years' War, I find it very interesting that that in terms of history and in terms of conversation, we separate out the 100 Years' War as its own sort of event, often thought of as a solitary event, when in reality, it is very much just a continuation of the conflicts that had been occurring in the generations before, and wouldn't continue to occur in the generations afterwards between England and France. So it seems somewhat arbitrary that all of a sudden you have this period of conflict that becomes known as the 100 Years' War, when there was conflict between the English and French royal families in the generations beforehand, and there would be in the generations after. Why do we delineate this period? And it's, you can make a strong case that one of the reasons that this gets singled out as a historical event is because we're really starting to see the creation of nations and states as an institution rather than just royal families on their own. And there is a distinct trend as the 100 Years' War goes on as this being a conflict of nations, not just a conflict of kings. So that's sort of a piece of it. And I think is largely one of the reasons why it gets separated into the 100 Years' War, as opposed to just a continuation of the conflicts. But that being said, if we, how early do we begin to set context becomes a rather fraught question looking at the 100 Years' War, because you could go back to the 1060s, looking at Edward the Confessor and William of Normandy into 1066 and the Norman invasion of England as very much a starting point, because you have these interconnected bands of fealty and relationships between the English royal family and the what would become the French royal family. Again, at the start of that period, the idea of countries is not a thing as we would understand it today. But I think probably for the sake of brevity, it's important to look at the Angevin kings of England. When Henry of England, who will become Henry the Second of England, when he becomes king, he has already married Eleanor of Aquitaine. And what that does is it brings the region of Aquitaine, France, into the control of the English royal family. Henry and his sons Richard and John have sometimes been accused of paying more attention to their continental possessions than England itself. And that's largely because their continental possessions were larger and in many ways more valuable than England itself, at least certainly in the early period. But to make a very, very, very long story, at least a little bit shorter, all of that falls apart during John's reign, and through what I would characterize as a complete mismanagement of the political, social, and military systems in both Normandy, Aquitaine, and England. John is going to lose almost all of the continental possessions of the English royal family. And so by the time we get to John's son, who is Henry III, ruling, the only part of the continental possessions that the English royal family is going to still control is going to be Aquitaine, and that's going to be rapidly reduced just to what we would call today Gascony. That continues despite the fact, I mean, Henry III, like his father, was not a particularly effective warrior king. His son, Edward I, is, by most accounts, arguably one of the best warrior kings of the High Middle Ages, maybe just falling shortly behind Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. But Edward is mostly concerned with conflicts in Wales and Scotland, far more than he's able to focus on trying to rebuild an English empire across the sea and expand on Aquitaine. There will be continuing lost ground during that period. And really, as far as the English royal family is concerned, where this becomes even more critical is under Edward I's son, Edward II. Edward II was not a successful military king. Arguably is king during the English's, one of their single most dramatic military defeats during the Scottish Wars at Bannockburn. So the question that came up, is it reasonable to consider the 100 Years' War as taking some metaphorical liberties with the actually longer period of contentious change? Yes, absolutely. And in some ways that's true of all military campaigns, not to get too philosophical, but when the question is asked, when does World War II start? Most Europeans and Americans would think September of 1939 with the invasion of Poland. It's a dramatically different point of view. However, if you look at the Sino-Japanese War and, Japan and China's conflict. So when do we claim wars beginning and wars ending can be a challenging subject. And I think that's very much the case, that the 100 Years' War is not even a cohesive military engagement. But what I think really sets the boundaries of it is, and this is sort of what we're leading up to, is that Edward III is going to basically claim the French crown in 1328. And that's sort of what's going to set off the military side of what we consider the 100 Years' War. And by the time we get to, sorry, double checking my dates, I just don't have them off the top of my head. By the time we get to the 1430s and 1440s, there's simply no way for England to continue, or the English kings to continue that claim of actually also having the French crown as part of their claim. And so that's I think why it gets defined separately from some of these previous. I mean, as far as, although Richard and John and Henry before them were certainly in conflict with the Capetian monarchs in France, they weren't claiming also to be the French kings. And after that, although King of France is going to be included in the English king's titles for quite a while, there's no realistic way to actually substantiate that claim by the time you get to the 1450s and the end of what we think of as the 100 Years' War. So that kind of gives our endpoints for why it gets sort of separated out in that way. So let's go back to Edward the Second of England briefly. Although sort of infamous for movie portrayals, particularly Braveheart, the real Edward II was not a particularly effective monarch, by any stretch of the imagination. His wife Isabella, however, was a very effective leader and ruler. and there's quite a bit of conflict in England between Isabella and her husband. In the end, that turns into, and essentially, the traditional story is that Edward II is essentially murdered on her behalf. Traditionally, a red hot poker inserted in his anus, probably a connection to the stories of his homosexuality. Whether there's any truth in that, it is often hard to tell because medieval stories are so often allegorical. So, and I do see the follow-up question, and I'll get there in one moment. But what comes out of sort of that conflict is the rise in influence of Edward II and Isabella's son, Edward III, who is going to be well known as a very effective military warrior king in his own right. And it's going to be, basically, it's going to be Edward III that is going to start the ball rolling in what we will consider the 100 Years' War. As far as why the 100 Years' War is separated out into its own single event, I think partially that's based on the sort of political will behind it, as far as English kings declaring themselves as kings of France as well. I think that certainly has a piece on it. I also think because militarily, it's traditionally been viewed as a fairly static in terms of strategy and tactics being used by both sides, and so it militarily fits into sort of a consolidated event as well. Like most wars, even ones far shorter than 100 years, you can generalize far too much. There is quite a bit of dynamic movement going on in armor and weapons throughout the period. Basically, you see, just as far as armor is concerned, the mix of mail and plate moved to very much the entirely plate enclosed warrior, at least particularly on the English side during the period. So there's certainly those trends. The English longbow is certainly influential throughout much of it, but by the end, gunpowder and cannon are having a huge influence in sieges and warfare. So there are military trends that change, but I think that is one of the reasons why it gets grouped that way. Mark, you had asked to be unmuted. Did you have a question? Well, again, if you do, certainly, unmute again or pop it in the chat, and I'd be happy to.
I'll unmute them 1 second. Sorry. The Mark W. Here it is. Mark, try to unmute yourself.
You were talking about me, Mark Witham. No, I didn't click on anything. No, sorry. I was just listening.
My mistake.
Yeah, I assumed you meant another Mark. Probably written with a K or something like that.
Andrew, since there is this reprieve, may I ask a question? Do you think that change of dynasty and succession crisis usually brings a lot of instability? And I think that really, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that what marked really the beginning of the war and the pretext for the invasion.
Absolutely. And whenever you have particularly a successful monarch in either, if we go to 1100 through this period, whenever there is a particularly strong monarch who dies, there is often a change in fortunes between who is ascendant between what we would consider England and France. But that carries through earlier as well. When in really shortly, the nutshell with the Angevins, you have Henry that pulls together this dramatic empire. His sons rebel, they're fighting rebellions, they're allying themselves with the French crown. Henry dies, all of a sudden the French crown and the sons are fighting with each other, and that goes through Richard's reign. Richard dies, more land is lost, that goes through John's reign. So the sort of conflict and back and forth is constant. throughout all of whenever there's a dynastic change or even just a change in monarch between them. It's even more dramatic when a line ends, and that's what's going to be particularly germane for Edward III. Who would I consider more powerful at the start? I would probably make the case. So let's start the 100 Years' War and see the events that lead into it, and maybe that will be more informative than just sort of narrowly answering the question. So, in essentially, what kicks everything off is that in 1328, Charles IV is going to die with no male heir, and he is going to be the last of the Capetian lines of French kings. With the death of Charles IV, and it essentially most of your French monarchs throughout this entire period are Philips or Charles. So keeping your Philips and Charles straight can be knotty to unravel. But there was very frequent intermarriage between particularly French princesses, although not a term that they necessarily would have used, and the English royal family. And so because Edward III's mother, Isabella, was the sister of Charles, Edward III is going to basically stake his claim for the French throne as a sort of direct line in terms of being the next male heir. That's going to be rejected out of hand by one of the systems that starts making this period more complex politically is that no longer do we have monarchs simply ruling by their claim of a hereditary rule, but we increasingly have institutions set in place that also control the fates of these nations. And that certainly was true beforehand, but they're really taking more powerful control. With Edward I, we start to have what we might call the initial parliaments today. You certainly have similar institutions in France, and they're essentially going to say that in French tradition, there is no possibility of inheriting the rule or taking the throne through the female line. And so Edward III's claim, because it comes through his mother, is completely invalid.
That is, I think, the Salian Franks law, right?
Yes.
The ancient, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And that looking at the differences in tradition between the French royal family and the English royal family, and how power is transferred, and what the ceremonies and systems are in place of that, is that could be a presentation all on its own, because they're vastly different. But essentially, this idea of Edward III being, saying, hey, I have the right to the French throne, is going to be rejected out of hand by sort of the systems they have in place in France for helping select a new heir. But what's going to make this even more complicated is at the same point, because again, we're still on the end of the Scottish Wars of Independence. You're going to have the creation during this period of what is traditionally be called the Old Alliance between Scotland and France to support each other against England. And so in the 1330s, English kings would have likely been speaking English by this point. You start to see that trend. Now, French is still the language of court, but you would start to see that English monarchs would also know English. Probably starts arguably with John, whether they spoke it all the time, but certainly having a knowledge of it. And certainly through the Edwards, that's where you start to see more of that. the Edwards and now English monarchs would have not considered themselves, even in the earlier ones that would have spoken, they actually would have spoken Norman French, so a different dialect than what we would consider French today. Modern French is also very heavily influenced by the French Revolution. As I understand it, I'm not a linguist, but in trying to figure out, particularly from my periods of study, Norman French, it's very much its own dialect compared with the Languedoc and Languedoc of medieval France at the time. And you've got two major dialectual groups within larger France as well. And so the English monarchs would not have considered themselves French, rather Norman or Angevin, or particularly Richard would have claimed strong ties to Aquitaine, which would have been the land of his mother's birth. So southwestern France. As far as a map, I don't have a map handy per se, but actually, maybe I do. Let me see. No, I'm afraid not. If you, I mean, as much as I hesitate to say, just run on the internet and do a Google search. If you, there's quite a particularly in 100 Years of War informational sites. There are quite a few political maps that might be helpful for figuring out what those borders are. One of the challenges, and the reason I'm not just giving a simple answer to that, is because it is fluid. The French kings, up until the end of the 100 Years War, really only claimed control of the Isle de France, the area centered around Paris, whereas the sort of outskirts, outer areas of France, Normandy, which would be northwest France, Aquitaine, which would be sort of central western France, would have been separate provinces, and although they would have had fealty to the French kings, also had their own dukes who had far more power in actual rule than we would attribute to English dukes or barons or things of that nature. One of the things, not to go on too much of a digression, but England is far more sort of politically unified in some ways than France throughout this period, because when William the Conqueror starts giving out lands to those that came across the English Channel with him in the Norman invasion, he doesn't give them areas to control that are all contiguous. And so you might get a section of Northumbria, northern England to control if you were one of William's barons or something like that. You might gain that, as well as a piece of land on the border with Wales, making you a marcher lord. And although you may still get the title of duke, and certainly we have those in existence, that doesn't mean that you controlled like a province or a region. The lands that you actually were in control of would have been scattered across England. This is great for the English crown because there are not politically important regions that are under the sole control of one person that can be sources of rebellion or political intrigue. And that is definitely not the case in France. In what we would think of as France today, if you were the Duke of Aquitaine, for example, Eleanor of Aquitaine's father is the Duke of Aquitaine. When he dies, she is his sole heir. And so Aquitaine, although it is under the fealty of the French king, it goes through her line. So when she marries Henry, who will become Henry II of England, the Aquitaine goes with her. And Henry II is King of England, Duke of Aquitaine, Duke of Normandy. And so politically, he controls that region. Now, Henry II was not the type of person to declare, swear direct fealty to a French king, but his son John is going to swear direct fealty to the French king, and that's going to get John in a lot of hot water at the French court and cause ramifications. But the sort of point of all of that is one of the strategies that England uses throughout this period, and they do it in the 100 Years' War, is they are going to essentially try to play off those regional rulers and provinces against each other. There we go. There we've got some maps. So yes, if you look at the sort of front map that's off there to the left, you've got green being France, purple areas being English claims, the light purple area centered on Bordeaux, that would be Gascony. That's about half of what Aquitaine had been in previous generations. This is lands claimed, the purple in this is lands claimed as of 1415. So that is well into the actual 100 Years' War. The purple area around Bordeaux is going to be the only region claimed at the start of it. And there's going to be even less claimed at the end of it. So that gives you sort of a viewpoint of the big swath of purple through the second. That's going to be the result of Henry V and the Agincourt campaign. But as you can see, English possessions and alliance with Burgundy. So making alliances with Burgundy, with what we would call today the Low Countries, all of those sort of political intrigues and alliances are going to be one of the tools that the English royal family is going to try to gain advantage of during the 100 Years' War, and had done previously and would continue to do so throughout up until France and England are allies in World War I, which sort of ends the hostility. But thank you for pulling up the map. Hopefully that is helpful. And if you look, not terribly huge on this map because it's got the extent of Henry V's sort of invasion, but the area around Paris, between Paris and Reims and Orleans, is going to be that Isle de France that traditionally is sort of the heart of what the French kings actually controlled. So hopefully that is helpful in kind of placing where the various regions are. And my apologies for not including a map first off, but I'm glad that came up. Thank you so much. All right, any other questions before we move forward? All right, so shortly after it is going to be Charles V who will take over from Charles IV. Completely different family line. I don't know that I have. Let me pull this up anyway, and maybe it will help make some more sense of.
Yeah, I think it was Philip the Fifth, right?
Yes.
It took over. Is a son of Charles Valois, who is a brother of uncle of Charles IV, and brother of their father Philip the Fair.
There we go.
Oh, I think it's Philip the Sixth even.
All right. I know that this isn't tremendously large. Did that slide come up? So I shamelessly stole this sort of royal family chart from the Royal Armories website. I give them full credit for it, but this is the single best layout for the various interrelations of these royal families that I've come across. So up at the top, you've got Philip II and the line splits between Philip IV, who will become King of France, and Charles of Valois, who further French kings will sort of come in line from. And then as we jump down, you can see Charles IV, who is the French monarch who dies, that sort of sets everything off. His sister Isabella is married to Edward II. And their son is Edward III. So Edward III is King of England when all of this starts. And when Charles IV dies, it is going to be Philip IV from the line of Charles of Valois, who is going to actually...
Six.
Yeah, I'm sorry, six. Too many Philips on my brain. Is actually going to... inherit the French crown, and so there are going to be our points of contact or points of conflict. I mean, Edward III and Philip VI at the start of the 100 Years' War. If you continue to sort of follow the family trees down, Edward III is going to have, excuse me, 5 sons in particular who are going to be influential in this period. The 2 that are going to have the most influence are going to be his eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, and eventually his 3rd son, John, better known as John of Gaunt, is going to be significant in sort of the future royal line. And we'll sort of get into the sort of path of those sons and their relationship to the story as we go. There's going to be quite a bit of conflict on both sides of the English royal family and French royal family as this goes through. And one of there's sort of 2 major pauses in the 100 Years' War that are both going to be caused by sort of disputes over succession, particularly in England, as they are largely, in many cases, the aggressors, but it's certainly going to have an influence in France as well. All right, so as mentioned, usually we the sort of traditional historiography breaks the 100 Years' War down into 3 different phases. The Edwardian Phase, which is going to be dominated by Edward III and militarily by his son, Edward the Black Prince. The Caroline Phase, which is going to be a period of French resurgence. And then with Henry V, we have the Lancastrian Phase, which is going to be the sort of final phase of the 100 Years' War. And then as that period ends, England is going to be launched into the turmoil of the War of the Roses, and France is going to sort of gain ascendancy and become a more unified nation, what we might consider a nation afterwards. So as far as how many, there's no realistic way to get what we would think of as modern casualty figures out of medieval warfare. Generally, the best that we can do is get figures of how many of the nobility are killed. And that's going to be a case, particularly with, Agincourt is arguably the best known battle of the 100 Years' War, and is certainly going to have an influence on the sort of French nobility, because there's so many casualties amongst French nobilities. I've heard the figure of 40% of the French nobility is basically killed at the Battle of Agincourt. Take any numbers from medieval battles with a healthy grain of salt. There's excellent scholarship being done to try to figure out better numbers of those who participate in those conflicts. Sadly, that is not an area that I can speak to off the top of my head. So hopefully, for those interested in more of the hardcore military story, there are probably people far better. Well, there's certainly people far better equipped to speak to that than I am. So the Edwardian phase of the 100 Years' War is best defined by 2 major battles. That would be Crécy and Poitiers. Crécy is in 1346 and Battle of Poitiers in 1356. They're both English victories. This is where you sort of get that start of the English habit of fighting dismounted, using massed longbowmen and men at arms and knights fighting on foot. That proved so immensely successful during the 100 Years' War. So by this point, England has moved militarily less from a feudal army to a I don't want to say a professional military force, because that concept doesn't really exist, but certainly professional soldiers who serve in these roles. We tend to think of everyone in armor fighting on a medieval battlefield had to have been a knight. That is certainly not the case for England in the 100 Years' War. Many of the notable commanders start off not actually being from the nobility as would have been defined at the time. There are successful soldiers who progress and become nobility during the period. You certainly have the elements of nobility that are still fighting, and there certainly are knights there, but it's not nearly what we think of in a traditional medieval army, a feudal army, where the higher lords call up their knights and their knights call up their peasants and they go to war. That is not how English armies during the 100 Years' War function. They are generally very professional in how they are organized and function in the field. One of the hallmarks of combat in the 100 Years' War is what was called the chevauchée. And the idea of a chevauchée, and it's certainly not new. It existed since there were mounted warriors fighting, is that everybody is on horseback. They move very quickly and they raid and destroy and cause havoc as they go. And this is largely how English armies are going to function during the period. The big difference that you see in the 100 Years' War, and these are gross generalizations, so please don't think that all English armies fought on horseback and then all started to dismount suddenly in the 100 Years' War, and this was kind of a new military innovation. It certainly wasn't. But generally, it's sort of the standard pattern of how English armies are going to succeed in battles during the 100 Years' War is they're going to be very mobile, which means if everybody's not mounted on a horseback, certainly large parts of the army are. They're going to move across French territory, burning, looting, destroying, breaking down the systems by which medieval society functioned. And then the other thing that is going to that allows them to do in many cases is pick and choose when and where they're actually going to fight battles. Most of the major battles we think of during the 100 Years' War are when an English force is moving through French territory, conducting these types of large scale, you could arguably call them raids, and they get trapped or they deliberately choose to fight with a French force that is trying to chase them. And that is certainly the case at Crécy, and that is also going to be the case at Agincourt. These are English armies that are moving through French territory who are either in a position where their best choice of action is to fight against France, or they are pinned by French armies and they're going to give battle. In terms of financing, that is absolutely, so if you're going to have a professional military force, that means you're paying your soldiers. That means you have to have some way of actually financing it. And that traditionally was one of the strengths of the English royal family. Even in previous generations, English armies, by and large, were much less feudal than French. And what I mean by feudal is a feudal army works through a system of connections, guarantees, and promises. So if you are in a feudal military system, if you are in France, and this is actually what's going to start off the 100 Years' War, is that Philip is going to declare an rare ban. He's going to call up the French military to help support the Scots in their fighting. And what that means is that if you are a French noble, you have been called up, you are going to go serve your feudal duty. You're going to bring the knights of your household. Your knights are going to bring their followers, and that is going to be how your army is constructed. You may also hire some mercenaries, crossbowmen, professional soldiers as part of that. But the army is going to be raised through those systems of feudal promises. English armies in the 100 Years' War, by and large, are not the sort of the last great English feudal army is the one that's destroyed at Bannockburn. After that, English kings, by and large, are going to use their wealth to hire on soldiers. Again, generalizations, to serve for those campaigns. And so you very well may be serving with your lord because those are the connections you have, but you're likely serving in those armies for pay versus you're fulfilling your feudal promises. And there's pieces of, in England, feudal armies are often not, even in earlier time periods, sent across the English Channel because part of the understanding of their duty doesn't extend to crossing the English Channel out of England. So there's pieces of that as well. But those are going to be some of the connections that make the two armies vastly different. Now, what is going to happen, just like you start to see these evolutions coming about in England through the generations before the 100 Years' War, you're going to start to see that professionalism increase in the French armies during the 100 Years' War. And the French military system by the end of the 100 Years' War is going to be far more professional than it was. Partially because after Agincourt, they literally have to rebuild the system to raise an army because so many of the traditional connections between the crown and their nobles and their knights are full of arrows, dead on the battlefield, or captured. It is really hard to say how medieval people, the everyday person, felt and understood their place in society because the individual people did not leave records, by and large, that come down to us today. So from a historical perspective, it's very difficult to understand how the average soldier on the battlefield felt about what they were doing in medieval war. That is a challenge. Glimpses can be gained. I am not familiar enough with those stories from the 100 Years' War to pull anything off the top of my head. That said, in England, it was very much the case that this was an opportunity for social advancement if you were willing to serve and if you had a talent for waging war. So there are notable Englishmen who gain pretty significant military and political power out of relative family obscurity because they are successful in what they do. As far as the idea of conscientious objection is going to be challenging to a medieval worldview for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that your understanding of how you fit in society is not based on a concept of your own will, the way that we in the 21st century tend to understand, at least 21st century American and European viewpoints tend to understand human life. Your purpose in the world was interconnected to how society worked. And part of that was your fealty to your king and your lords, particularly in older feudal systems. And so the concept that you had the ability to choose your role in society in many ways was already chosen for you. And so your ability to choose, hey, I don't want to go to war, so I'm just not going to do that, doesn't generally fit in with that sort of medieval world viewpoint. That said, And that's kind of exactly like, as you just posted, wouldn't war have been considered just among the various trials and pestilences of medieval life? Yes. So in a American and European modern worldview, the idea that you do not have personal control over every element of your life is considered very, very negative. However, I think you can make a pretty substantial case that we suffer quite a bit over the choices we make in our life because we understand to have so much control over them. This may be too far of a rabbit hole to get down, and I don't want to, this isn't a sociological conversation, but if you do not fundamentally understand yourself as having much control over your life, your ability to accept the life that is given you is in many ways simpler than in a modern Euro-American viewpoint where you are supposed to take control over every element of your life. And when something that you have no control over impacts your life, it can have dramatic negative effects on, why couldn't I do more in that situation? If that makes any sense whatsoever. There's a fundamentally different worldview between sort of French and English medieval point of view and the modern point of view that we often have today. One of the things, and we're not quite there chronologically, but the Black Death hits 1348, right in the middle of the 100 Years' War. Well, right at the start of the 100 Years' War, essentially. And by the end of the 100 Years' War, Black Death's going to kill far more people than any of the military conflict in the 100 Years' War. That's going to have a far more dramatic effect on the average person's lifespan average person's, to be fair, in the average person is not only going to suffer through that, but is certainly going to know and be closely related to people that have died. Entire communities are wiped out. And so your understanding of in a military conflict today, the thing that is most dangerous to you is the conflict. In a military conflict up until World War II, the most dangerous thing to you in that conflict was illness rather than the war itself. And so this is one of the reasons why when we look at like the Napoleonic Wars or the American Civil War, and people are like, well, why did they just like charge into battle and like have these large scale fraught military campaigns where there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of sense to it? Well, your army was more likely to disappear through disease if you didn't do something than it was through those actions on the battlefield. And so there's a very different rationale, military rationale behind why you do things. You might be willing to throw the dice on what we would think of today as a very very long odds military action that would have been perfectly acceptable in pre-World War I, because your army was suffering more casualties just by existing than it was, than it necessarily would by continuing to fight. Keeping an army in the field before World War II is challenging simply from the perspective of disease and the amount of casualties you suffer just by grouping masses of people together. As far as how churches felt about the war, I mean, the relationship between churches, between the church and royalty is very interconnected. In most of these countries, in most European countries during the medieval period, the high-ranking clergy are picked by the royal family. They're from the same families. They're interconnected in that way. And so there's a tremendous amount, the church and the royal families are very much interconnected. That doesn't mean they always agree. That doesn't mean they always work together. But the idea of, the church coming out against conflict varies dramatically during the period. And and tends to be, just because the Pope has said something doesn't necessarily mean that the clergy within England or France is going to follow it wholeheartedly, or not try to sidestep it if that is in the best interests of the prelates of the English or French churches. And you see popes, previous popes to the period, and I'm not as familiar on the church history during the 100 Years' War, but certainly earlier popes had tried to use like excommunication as a way of influencing political events and overplayed their hands. And when you're excommunicating everybody, all of a sudden it doesn't have nearly the same sting as it did before. And so that's the church tended to be careful of overplaying its hand in some respects during the medieval period. Absolutely, armies are much smaller during this period than in the beginning of the 19th century. Armies are much smaller in the 19th century than the 20th century. Our ability to keep large bodies of troops in the field is infinitely larger today, and in the last 200 years than in time periods before that. So there's a lot of these various pieces that sort of come into play.
Andrew, I just wanted to ask, if I remember correctly, this is the time when the French kings controlled the popes, because there was a pope in Avignon by that time.
Correct.
Yeah, they're from the Philip the Fair, which is the Philip the Fourth, and he was the one who established his own pope, and from there on through the 14th century. So I would imagine the pope would support the French side.
Yes, but a similar sort of reasoning is going to be less likely to be taken seriously in some respects by the English clergy. And the ecclesiastical history and interrelation between popes and their legates and prelates and the rulers of the church in various nations is a very dense and fascinating sort of path throughout the medieval world, because there are some instances where the Pope says something and everybody goes along with it, and it is what you would think of as a medieval church being that powerfully influential. And there's other times where everybody's essentially blowing off what the Pope is saying and doing their own thing anyway. And so that can be fraught to unravel as well. But that's that's the fact that Philip is able to essentially have complete French control over the papacy during this period certainly means that that officially, at least, the from a religious perspective, the French papacy is certainly not going to be against the goals of the French monarchy. Excellent questions through the chat. If again, any others before we sort of dive back in? All right. So again, we have Battles of Crécy and Poitiers, 1346. Poitiers is 1356. Black Death is going to start making itself known in 1348. Philip is going to die in 1350, and John II is going to be crowned King of France. And in 1355, you're going to have sort of a whole new round of chevauchés being led by the Black Prince, eldest son of Edward III. And that's going to lead, actually, what leads into the Battle of Poitiers. And at Poitiers, John is going to be taken prisoner by the French armies. His son, who will become Charles V, is going to serve as regent during that period. English armies are still going to attempt to maintain in the field. There's actually, supposedly on Easter 1360, there is a massive hailstorm that supposedly killed 1,000 English soldiers during the chevauchés as the Black Prince was attempting to take Reims. But what is going to be the end result of this by 1360 is that there's going to be a treaty that sort of pauses the 100 Years' War. And essentially, Edward III is going to get control of all of Aquitaine, but in basically what in terms of bartering that, he's going to give up any English claims to Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and those regions toward the French crown. And this is sort of going to there's going to be a period of peace till about 1369, largely because the French king is being held prisoner in England. John very much lived up to his promises of military ransom, which is a very strong, like he's allowed to go back to France to help organize his own ransom. And while he's there, the hostage standing in for him dies. So he goes back to England to be a hostage again. So this is not, this seems very strange to a modern worldview, but that was certainly the decisions that he made. And John is actually going to end up dying in England in 1369.
Andrew, if I may, because I recently just read about this, it's actually the hostage for the John was his youngest son, and he didn't die; he escaped. And that was much worse because he violated the
you're
code
right.
of honor.
You're right. You're right. He did escape, and it violated the code of honor that John had sworn to. And so he ends up going back into English captivity. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah. But this is amazing that John was so much about his this is the time of chivalry. I mean, it's really representative. But I think also the result of this treaty was because France was financially devastated by the ransom. It was absolutely destroyed the economy of France.
I mean what do you calculate the ransom for a king at? I mean, it's astronomical, a literal king's ransom. And so not only do you have the financial strains of that, but again, although we tend to isolate the 100 Years' War, there's conflict going on in the south of France with Navarre during this period that is also having a major influence over the decisions that are being made. All of these various pieces coming into play. So chivalry is an interesting term, and to our modern idea, going back to serve your ransom would be considered very chivalric. In its original form, chivalry is actually very specifically related to its root word, and that is to horsemanship. And so if you told John II of France that he was being very chivalric in going back to serve his ransom, he would probably look at you as though you were crazy, because he would not understand what this had to do with his horsemanship and his relationship to other horsemen, that is being a knight. And so we have taken that term because it was used in that connection. Originally, chevalerie is simply you're living the life of a horseman. And what does that mean in early medieval history is living the life of a knight. And so it takes on then meaning of how you interact with other knights and gains more and more layers on top of it as it is used. What John might have understood more was this was being a proud home, which doesn't have a great translation today, but is the best translated as being the right kind of man. And that certainly was important as well. And because those two elements become very important in medieval knighthood, we sort of combine them in our modern view of chivalry. But if you've ever, where does the term chivalry come from? Well, cheval, horse. It is connected to, what are the appropriate actions of a horseman, and is literally like horsemanship originally. And chevaucher, the sort of military campaign on horseback, cheval, same root word. So absolutely right. So Wayne, your question about how did society deal with the after effects of warfare? I can't tell you for sure in the 100 Years' War period, but 3 generations beforehand, there would be 2 different elements that would be connected into it. And I imagine society dealt with it in much the same ways. And that is your connection within medieval society to your lord and the church would have been very much involved. And so in England in 1100, if you went to war for your lord, because England, several generations earlier is working in that feudal system, and you are killed, the understanding is that, your lord is still beholden to your family to help take care of them afterwards, as well as the rest of your society. Where things get far more complicated during the 100 Years' War is less related to the military side of the war than to the Black Death. Okay, so the bubonic plague killed 1/3 of Europe, absolutely wiped out some towns and villages and communities. And so the strains on society because of the Black Death were absolutely immense. Strangely enough, and it seems counterproductive from our modern viewpoint, but in England particularly, if you survived the Black Death, you were probably better off in terms of your status in life than you ever had been before. Because one of the particularly in England, one of the impacts of the Black Death is because it kills so much of the populace and proportionally more of the poorer elements of society, because they are always hit harder by plague and famine and the things that become associated with it, because of lack of access to the resources to sort of fight that, is that they tremendously move up in the potential power that they have over the aristocracy. You actually can have peasants who are arguing for higher wages successfully after the Black Death in England because there aren't enough workers to go around. And so the whole paradigm changes of where the power base is in society, partially related to that. And it's going to swing back and forth as any of those kinds of changes do in society. The lower classes gain more power, and then there's going to be a backlash from the aristocracy against it. We see that happen in all kinds of systems, all sorts of political systems and time periods over history, and is going to happen as well. So, although you've got lower class gaining more rights, you also start to have laws about, what kinds of clothing you can wear and how many buttons your coats can have to help distinguish between aristocracy and the rest of the populace. And so all these various elements and pieces come out. But the systems in the medieval world to help deal with that are going to be your relationship to, because you're still, even in England, even when you start to see things like wages for soldiers and hired tradesmen becoming more influential, you still have the manorial system of workers working for a lord, giving part of their produce to that lord in exchange for that lord protecting them and taking care of them. That element of society is going to help deal with these calamities, in addition to the church is going to do that as well. Medieval lords and the medieval church often play very badly to a modern worldview. However, there are certainly lots of evidence of both systems being far more fair and gracious compassionate to what we would, to peasants than we often would think of today, because of the interconnected relationships that exist in society. So it's hard to make too many generalizations when we look, and often our modern, a lot of our modern viewpoints of the aristocracy versus the working, come out of 18th and 19th century modern history, and concepts of working class and class relations, which are very much a post-industrial understanding of society. So let's head back to 1369. Edward III is still King of England. Charles V is going to be King of France. There is Aquitaine has become has been given back to the English crown, and is under the direct control of Edward the Black Prince. And there's going to be a dispute over taxation in Aquitaine because everybody's been fighting this war. Everybody's broke. The English are suffering financially as well as the French. Edward the Black Prince in Aquitaine is going to impose levy taxes. And there is going to be a dispute with a noble in Aquitaine who had actually served with the English armies and been an ally. And what is going to happen is that dispute, because Aquitaine is technically under the fealty of the French crown, even though a English prince is in charge of it through the direct English line. As a feudal dispute, it needs to be solved at the French court. And so Charles V is going to summon the Black Prince to court. The Black Prince is going to say, I'm not coming to your feudal court because that's not going to be a fair hearing. And we have conflict breaking out all over again. The English do less well during this period of the 100 Years' War. And let me go there. All right. So the figure you see reposing there on the left is Edward the Black Prince. That is his absolutely magnificent tomb effigy in the highest military fashion of the day. The English are not going to do as well during this phase, which is one of the reasons, the Caroline phase, we've got the name has shifted to the French royal family rather than the English royal family, as sort of a reflection of that, for a number of reasons. Now, John of Gaunt and Edward the Black Prince are both fantastic military leaders. Edward III actually hangs in there as a king for a very long time. He is going to, spoiler alert, he is going to survive Edward the Black Prince, which is why Edward's name is not there in red with the Lion of England above it. Edward is going to die in the Black Prince is going to die in 1376 of dysentery. And then the year after that, Edward III is going to die himself. And going through the direct male line, we have primogeniture and direct male line for English kings by this point, is going to be Edward's very young son, Richard II, who is going to be crowned King of England. It's going to take many years before Richard II is actually going to be able to rule in his own right, but there's never a direct regent placed over him, which is kind of unusual. Usually if an underage king is appointed, you have a direct regent. In this case, there's various councils that are supposed to help him out. Richard II is not going to be a tremendously well-liked king in many respects. There's a lot of unrest in England at the time, and Charles is going to be able to take advantage of this, and the French are going to end up reconquering most of Aquitaine by 1378. As part of all of that, there's going to be more conflict with the Scots, and you're also going to have the Peasants' Revolt in England, which is, again, other great stories there. But Richard II is actually going to, it's one of his, I guess you could say, one of the few actions where he shows real great leadership as a king. And there's, the peasants and the peasants who are in the Peasants' Rebellion and sort of the loyalists, I guess you would call them, have met. There's a scuffle that breaks out, and the leader of the peasants is cut down by some of the guards, and it looks like everything's going to all, completely get out of hand. And Richard II, who's a teenager, is going to ride up to the peasants and saying, "I will be your leader," and it's going to move them. And the peasants' revolt is essentially going to fall apart after that. But again, peasants' revolt connected into Black Death. Peasants are getting have more political control than they had before, because of the need for workers and the fact that there is fewer workers involved. So in the beginning of kingship, how did someone become a king? It is vastly different depending on the time and the nation and the society and all of those systems. Traditionally in England, it takes being anointed and being acclaimed. Being anointed means that you have sacred oil chrism placed on your forehead. Being acclaimed means that you're basically brought forward to the people who all shout and cheer that you are king. Those are kind of the two elements in English tradition that go back all the way back to William the Conqueror, that are part of kingship. The story at William the Conqueror's coronation is that when they gave the acclaim, it was so loud that William's soldiers thought it was an uprising and went through London and slaughtered people and caused havoc, because they didn't understand basically that process. So those are the two pieces that in sort of English tradition for declaring kingship. As far as French traditions are concerned, there you have me. I don't have the sort of functions that would be undertaken. But if you are English and you can claim that you have been anointed and you have been acclaimed, then you get to be king. There are individuals who have been either anointed or acclaimed, but not both, who never actually become king. Philip of yet another Philip of France during John's reign would be one example. Lady Jane Grey would be another example of individuals who did not fulfill all of the criteria to become king, even though part of they thought they were king and queen in Lady Jane Grey's case, but history has not remembered them as such because all of the formalities did not go through, and because they were either overthrown or executed or not able to secure their kingship. But those are the pieces that are involved in becoming a king. So by 1378, we have the sort of most of Aquitaine back in control of the French. We have a peasants' revolt dying or ongoing and about to wrap up in England. We have continued Scottish wars. And this is going to end up in what's known as the second piece of the 100 Years' War, which is going to last until 1415. As part of sort of the unrest in England, Richard II is going to go through some bouts of insanity. There's quite a bit of insanity going back and forth between some of our monarchs in this case. There's going to be periods where England is going to be under the control of sort of a council of nobles, or the very earliest elements of what we might consider a parliament today. There's going to be some conflict between various individuals. Joan of Gaunt, who's very close to his nephew, and so that is going to sort of be an influence in these councils, and he is going to gain and lose power depending on the exact period during that peace. Eventually, Joan of Gaunt is going to for a period of time, there's a group called the Lords Appellates who take sort of regent control over England. Much of this debate is over taxation, just like the French are broken debating, taxation over John's ransom earlier is an issue. That's going to be the case here in England as well. John of Gaunt is going to end up coming back to England, overthrowing the Lords Appellate, and then he is going to die. His son, there's a scuffle between Richard II and John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke is going to be disinherited. He's going to leave. He's going to end up coming back to England. There's going to be a sort of successful uprising, and he is going to be crowned as Henry IV. This is going to end up leading into our third and final major phase of the 100 Years' War. Henry IV is going to die in 1413, and his son Henry V is going to be crowned. And Henry V is going to sort of renew the territorial claims on French lands, and he's going to demand Catherine, daughter of Charles V of France, hand in marriage, which the French are going to reject. And the war is going to break out all over again. And this is where we get to what's often known as the Lancastrian Phase. Just like Richard II was suffering mental illness, that's going to be an issue in Charles VI's reign as well. And so sort of using the rejected English claim on the French, French territories and the hand of Catherine as a pretext, as well as, using, there's unrest in France, and Charles VI, own bouts of mental illness are an issue. That is going to be the pretext that Henry V is going to use to relaunch the war, and which is going to lead into Agincourt, the Agincourt campaign. Agincourt.
Yeah, Andrew, it just thought occurred to me that it's kind of ironic that Henry V's son, Henry VI, is also going to have a mental illness, and was the beginning of the War of Roses. Because of that, otherwise Richard of York would have never challenged him, right?
Absolutely.
It's like really ironic that his own son. Yeah. All right. Sorry.
It would be interesting to see. I mean, there's no way to do a medical diagnosis at this point. But when you have a father whose grandson also suffers mental illness, it would be interesting to go through and see if there is enough documentary evidence of what the illness was, both for Henry VI and Charles VI, to see if there's any connection through Catherine.
Yeah, it could be some genetic, because from what I read, the Henry VI, he went like catatonic at some point, right?
For large periods of time, he's catatonic. Absolutely. And that is absolutely. So, I mean, very much the same thing. It's sort of the same issues that go on in John's kingship. Also, many of them return in Richard II's kingship, and many of those same issues are in Henry VI's kingship, where you have and Henry VI, it's exacerbated by being catatonic and not actually being able to rule. But you have sort of high taxation. You have dukes and barons who have as much or more real financial wealth as well as political clout than the monarch themselves, and that is what so often leads you into these periods of civil war and violence within the various countries. Certainly the case in Richard II with Bolingbroke coming back and becoming Henry IV, and very much the case of Henry VI leading into the War of the Roses, which please forgive me, there is no way on earth I will ever try to do a political background to the War of the Roses, because it is so fraught, and there are so many changing tides that is a lifetime of study in and of itself, but I find it fascinating. I just never have been able to wrap my head around it well enough to do a good job explaining it to anyone else. But if you're interested in, I mean, both, 100 Years' War and War of the Roses, I mean, this is essentially Game of Thrones in history. That is very much the character. I mean, that is essentially what Martin based the concepts of Game of Thrones about in many respects, were these periods of English history. So Henry, as we know, Harry the King is going to be very successful at the Battle of Agincourt and essentially wipe out half of the French nobility. Henry is going to be able to retake Normandy. He is going to marry Catherine. The Dauphin, Charles, who will become Charles VII later on, is going to be declared illegitimate. There is going to be a couple minor, or well, certainly not minor if you are involved in, but there are going to be some battles in this phase that the English lose. But the vast majority of them are English arms are going to be successful, including Verneuil in 1424. And essentially, Henry V is going to be successful in gaining the line of kingship for his son Henry VI. Unfortunately, Henry V, like so many of these military commanders, is going to fall to dysentery. And in that period following that is when you get the rise of Joan of Arc. You have continuing sort of cascading failures in England, of England being able to sort of control itself, and you end up going, basically English war aims end up failing, and the French are able to sort of have a resurgence and reconquer most of the territory they have lost. The only thing that is going to hold out is going to be Calais. Calais is going to remain English until I think it's 1558 before Calais finally falls. But there's essentially no way after that for England to continue trying to struggle in the 100 Years' War, especially with the impact of Henry VI's catatonic states, empty war coffers, and the War of the Roses following on that. So questions in chat. What factors started the 100 Years' War? Long and complicated story, but essentially Edward III thought he had a good claim on the French crown, and that's sort of what kicks it off. And then it really just sort of falls apart here at the end, with the descent into the War of the Roses in England, preventing England from taking any more meaningful part in the 100 Years' War.
Andrew, may I ask a couple of questions? Sorry.
Absolutely.
I'm trying to so many questions. So thanks everybody participating, and we definitely will open the Q&A a little bit as well. But first question is, what was the relationship between peasantry and nobility in France, both in France and in England? Second of all, that famous Joan of Arc movie, I can never get over the minute how the peasantry, French peasantry particularly, hated English troops. There was a moment where the sister of Joan of Arc first getting killed and then getting raped by one of the soldiers, one of the British soldiers, or I'm sorry, one of the English soldiers, and therefore kind of like seeding this whole, here's evil troops coming type of thing. So those are the two questions I have. I'm sorry.
So speaking to the latter one, I mean, that is medieval warfare. Medieval warfare is by and large comprised of two elements. The first is complete destruction of the landscape. And philosophically, this comes out partially from the feudal system. If you've sworn fealty to a lord, that in exchange for your service, they will protect you. And that is the basis of your relationship. And an enemy army comes through, destroys all your crops, kills all your livestock, murders your family, that your lord is no longer doing their job, and clearly is not able to fulfill their part of that deal. So why would you still serve that lord? That is a critical element of medieval combat. The second piece to medieval combat is sieges, because castles, in less so in the 100 Years' War than a generation earlier, but still definitely it's starting to shift from castles to cities by this point, because that's also how society is starting to be organized. But castles in the high Middle Ages, and when we talk about medieval periods, 100 Years' War is right at the cusp, moving from the high Middle Ages to the late Middle Ages, as historians kind of define it. But in the high Middle Ages, you think of castles as aircraft carriers on the landscape. You have your knights in your castles, and they control all the territory around them, that they, because of the use of horses, to be able to launch warfare. And if you cannot take those castles out of the equation, then you are never going to be able to safely control any of the territory within a day's ride of that particular castle. And so that's why you have sieges being the other big part of military conflict. So if you can't win the siege, launch your chevauchée through the countryside, burn everything, destroy everything, and show them that their lords can't actually do their job. And if you have the military capacity and you want to take the land, what you have to do is you have to take the castles, and you have to either have to do that usually through sieges rather than through assault. Although, both elements are certainly used. And so you see that in the 100 Years' War. Good example, Crécy and Agincourt are battles as a result of armies moving through the countryside, destroying everything as they go. Agincourt comes right at the tail of sieges that have been launched at Barfleur by Henry V. So you have that connection as well. You have the Siege of Orleans. You have the Black Prince's attempts to take Reims, where the hailstorm kills 1,000 people in his army. That is an attempt to launch siege to reduce that city. And so both of those elements are very, very much in play going on. As far as the relationships between lords and their peasants, I am not very well equipped to speak to that in France, and I'm better equipped to speak to it in England during the Angevin period. And that is, it varied as much as the relationship between, as the relationships as they actually existed. Just like you can have great bosses and bad bosses. Anybody in authority can be a fantastic leader or a poor leader. You have the same dynamics in the Middle Ages. There were good lords who were a joy to live on their manors, and then you had pretty rotten ones who it was certainly unpleasant. So both of those elements very much exist. The idea, at least initially, and all political systems have flaws, and all political systems are open to debate. But the idea of the interconnectivity of medieval society is, it's not just you are my peasants, you're on my land, therefore you do what I say. It's that we are interconnected through the promises we make to each other to support each other. You, as a farmer on the land, cannot afford a horse and a suit of armor and a sword or a lance to be able to defend your land. And anybody that has those things is going to be able to come by and take it away from you. So here's how we'll make this work. You collectively as a group, you will work the land which will allow enough money to be raised to buy the expensive horse and armor and give one person enough time by themselves to learn how to ride the horse and fight effectively in that armor. And that is a full-time job to be able to learn all those skills. And then that one person, that lord, can then defend all the other people who are working the farm. That is feudalism in the most simplistic viewpoint. England gets complicated because in England there is a definite difference between being a freeman peasant and a serf. Serfs grow out of classical slavery. As you have the rise of Christianity, slavery as it was understood, the classical world is at odds with Christianity as practiced in the early medieval worldview. And so you need to somehow change the system because you are not going to completely change the economic basis of society overnight. So the system has to be changed so that it's not slavery, but that it still works so that society doesn't completely fall apart. And so that's where serfdom comes from. And the idea of serfdom is that not that the person is the direct property of the lord, but a serf, they are directly connected to the land, and which is a subtle difference, but is a functional difference in how it operates. And so what that means is that if that land changes hands, then the loyalty of the serf changes hands, rather than it being connected directly to the person who's controlling it. And so that's, at least in England, how the system is working. But what happens in England is that there are probably far more freemen than there are peasants, particularly by the time of the 100 Years' War. And a freeman can vote with their feet. If you are if they are on your land and they are a freeman and they decide that the lord over there is going to do a better job, they can pick up their family and move off. And go somewhere else. They are not in any way, shape, or form bound to you unless there is some kind of contract that is made, and that, medieval contracts certainly existed, and that certainly happened. But you're not connected the way we think of medieval peasants as being under the crushing foot of their lords. And while those circumstances certainly did exist, that is not the only way in that the system existed. And personally, I think particularly in the high Middle Ages, you tended to see far more interplay between those elements of society than we would think existed today. England lost most of their continental territories 100 years before the war. It started. That is correct. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Okay. I'm sorry, Greg. That was in response to Michael's question.
Yeah, that's right. Because you were talking about something else.
Yes. No, sorry there. I can actually stop screen sharing because maybe. There we go. All right. Does anyone else have any questions? So I have a tendency, particularly in my past presentations, to run long, like an hour longer. So I tried to time this one to actually not run 3 hours. You can tell me later whether you prefer it or not. But I wanted to try to make sure that we had plenty of time for questions and conversation at the end without having to crunch things too much. So if there's any other questions, please don't hesitate to put them into chat or to raise your hand or any of the other Zoom functions. And I am happy to answer them as best as I can.
So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to unmute people that raise hands. So we have Mark. Mark, go ahead.
Okay, so you'd said earlier on in those 3 phases, they were named after like the Caroline phase because the French were doing better than the last one, the Lancastrian, they were doing better. But that's when the English lost. And like the last battle of Castillon was an English defeat. Why would that, final English defeat be named, after, the Lancastrians if they eventually lost?
If you ask even a fairly well educated group to name a battle from the 100 Years' War, what are they going to name?
Crécy or Agincourt?
And I would make the case that Agincourt is that the average person is far more likely to know Agincourt than everything else, partially and understandably because Shakespeare, I mean, Henry V is just an amazing play, and has continued in St. Crispin's Day speech, and the once more into the breach speech. I mean, these I know middle school students in my school still read the St. Crispin's Day speech as part of the curriculum, and so knowing nothing else about the 100 Years' War, by and large, people are going to know who Henry V is, or at least there was a Henry V, and know something about Agincourt. And so I think that that is largely why it's still known as the Lancastrian Phase, is because Henry V, and like Henry V wins it, right? He gets it. He gets the English crown for his son. He just also then dies, and it's not able to be held. But I think that's the reason why, particularly in English dominated history, why it gets the Lancastrian name. You're absolutely right that eventually it is lost, but Henry V, looms so large in that viewpoint. I think he gets the title for his name because of it.
Okay, then perhaps French historians have different phases or phase names.
They very well may, and I do not know the French historiography for the 100 Years' War, and which would be a fascinating subject in and of itself. I can do that with other time periods, but not as well with the 100 Years' War, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for your time and effort.
Absolutely.
Please raise your hands if you have any questions, but I have this one question, Andrew, that has been killing me. Back at home, when I was a kid, we used to learn about Joan of Arc. But did they really were afraid that Joan of Arc, once they submit the ransom, would come back and become, I don't know, a queen, I guess, or a princess? I don't know. What was the scare? I mean, she's a peasant, a simple peasant, and they could have used her as in their advantage. Instead, they were scared of her. French, I meant.
Anytime somebody who's outside of the normal system of play gets that kind of enthusiastic support, it gets very, very uncomfortable for the people who are in charge. And that is Wat Tyler and the Peasants' Revolt in England is the corollary. I mean, Wat Tyler is killed. The story is by accident, but the fact that it allowed Richard II to immediately sort of take ownership of the Peasants' Revolt, even though he was the king, and sort of change that paradigm is very, very powerful for him. And so if I were really, really, really going to be cynical, and I don't think that it is necessarily intentional, but we convince ourselves of a lot of things in our lifetime, whether they we necessarily know them to be true or not, because they fit in with what we want to believe. Someone like Joan of Arc is tremendously powerful as long as she's working on your side, but there's no telling what she's going to do later on. And I'm not saying that a conscious understanding of that was necessary and influence, but I think that those kinds of pre-ingrained understandings and relationships often cause instances like Wat Tyler's death and Joan of Arc's death and things of that. As far as the understanding the French perspective would be would really be interesting from the 100 Years' War. And you're absolutely right, Patty, in that particularly, and this is, I'm an East Coast United States citizen. I grew up in Maryland. I've lived in Maryland my entire life. I've spent most of my time on the East Coast of the United States, so I can speak to that region maybe better even than other areas of the United States. But speaking as an educator and a historian in the United States, particularly, because much of the governmental systems that would spread across the entire continent started based on English common law, understandings of English common law, and by an extension, because of how common law works, English history is ingrained into kind of an American viewpoint of world history. So the American viewpoint of world history pre the existence of America is by and large a English viewpoint. It is just sort of accepted as part of American history as well. For those of us on the East Coast of the United States, our histories in our regions are very much tied into English history, because by and large, those regions were settled or at least very early on conquered by England. That remains part of our historiography. Where this just fascinates me is if you are from California, you should have a vastly different worldview, because you were controlled by Spain far longer than you were controlled by the United States at this point. And so it is interesting that English viewpoint, because it is baked into the political system, ends up being just as prominent in other parts of the United States, despite the fact that from an actual local history of where I live, it is not necessarily as germane as it would be in Maryland or Virginia or DC, Pennsylvania, East Coast. But that's a whole, historiography and why we understand things the way we do and the way that we understand them is very much a part of actually, talking history and understanding history, because it really defines, our viewpoint on what we think is history.
So I've muted everybody. That whoever wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, and then you'll be given a chance to speak. So let me know. We have about 8-9 minutes left. Just want to make sure that we take advantage. Patty, you've had several questions. Do you want to maybe vocalize them?
I'm not sure. What are you asking me, Zach?
You said I have several questions, and you wanted to discuss anything that you wanted to maybe vocalize?
Well, I do think it would be fascinating to learn more about the French perspective. That's been part of the attraction to Richard's series, because I have that same kind of East Coast deal going on, where I have always understood and learned and been taught history through that British perspective. And I was just typing in a comment on what Andrew was just saying. I mean, very recently, an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court deeply and heavily and unquestionably referenced ancient Egypt English common law.
Yep. So
that I don't know if a lot of Americans, my sense is that a lot of Americans are losing that deep understanding of their roots. And a lot of people seem like utterly shocked. Not just that he would pull that deeply into English common law, but that such common law existed. I don't know that a lot of Americans understand where our system of law and justice came from. So those are the things I was thinking, Zach, if anybody finds that interesting. But yes, a French perspective would be fascinating, I think.
I mean, we do have a French side, like Louisiana was just sold to by, Napoleon fairly, with 200, 300 years ago.
And interestingly, Louisiana contains or has sort of retained elements of French. It's not colonial rule, because that's the wrong term to use, but of being a French territory in ways that areas of the United States that were under the control of other powers never did. France still works under a parish Louisiana still works under a parish rather than a county system. So there are still elements of sort of French,
and Napoleonic Code.
Yes, yeah, French judicial law still has elements in Louisiana, whereas, and I was fascinated by Aaron's concept that there's not a Spanish point of view in California. I mean, where the same circumstances existed in terms of setting up the territorial rule, although Spain and France had vastly different ways of controlling territories, particularly than the English. But and partially through because of being taken, instead of being taken by like purchase, being taken through conquest, that is almost entirely discarded. You don't have a Spanish system of jurisprudence in the territories taken in the Mexican-American War, whereas you do still have elements of that in Louisiana. And
well, I think a big part of that is the impact of Napoleon III and Maximilian in Mexico. So that sort of almost is this hard reset, from it's like a massive Windows reboot almost. And, that sort of impacts the Western continental history, at least in the United States and in Mexico. I mean, it totally impacts Mexican history, obviously. So,
when did the current royal family in Britain come to power?
so the House of Hanover comes over with George I in England, and that's essentially turn of the 17th. Turn of the 17th, 18th century. And they're basically imported from Germany, Hanover, Germany, because there's no Western European royal family that is not interconnected with other Western European families. If you wanted to find a pretext for why they are acceptable kings, you certainly can find one. But the reason that the House of Hanover was so attractive, particularly at that point, is among other things, that they were solidly Protestant. George I didn't speak English. He spoke German.
I see.
Yeah, it's interesting to that effect, Andrew. During the World War I, Kaiser Nikolai II and King George were cousins.
And Nikolai I, King George and Kaiser Wilhelm are all.
There was a story. Yeah, there was a story that King George, who obviously was a Greek descent, went with his cousin Nikolai to Japan. That's kind of like started on Russian hate against Japanese. And one of the Japanese policemen, they were visiting Japan. That was before the Russo-Japanese War. And one of the Japanese policemen attacked Nikolai I and was able to hammer away and hacked like a piece of his skull. And King George, actually using his cane, protected Nikolai I of Russian Tsar. And Russian Tsar called Japanese people makacas, which means dirty monkeys. And that's how the complete hate for Japanese started, because of that fact, and then precipitated to the Russo-Japanese War as well. But the King George at one point protected his cousin almost from the certain death.
I think I'm trying to, and this is apocryphal at this point, and I don't have resources, but I think all three of them, they were all face to face at Queen Victoria's funeral, because they were all, directly connected. That's where the current House of Hanover comes from.
Any other questions, you guys, or kind of coming up on the time? And then, we could thank Andrew. I mean, if you do want to thank Andrew, go to our YouTube channel, and there's a button that says thank you with a little bit of dollar sign, anything, a little bit of help. We'll send a thank you card to Andrew. It'd be nice to have a little bit, just buy a coffee here and there.
I am happy just to have the chance to talk history.
Oh, I know.
I love my career, but my career path has taken me now down it. Whereas at one point in my life, I used to get to talk to teenagers every day about history. Now I talk with teachers about how to be better teachers, which is very rewarding and very necessary, but I just love getting a chance to talk history with people. So thank you for letting me talk history at you for hours at a time every so often.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Then we do want you to come back, and every time you come back, we have big crowds, which is is definitely a testament to giving us really good entertaining presentation in history. And I don't know, we can use entertaining to history, but you make it very entertaining. So that
thank you, Andrew. I mean, great conversation, and I really would love you to come back and talk more history, since you like it so much. I love to listen and participate.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for fantastic questions. Maybe we need to look into there's some good questions about like Louisiana Purchase and 19th century US stuff. So maybe there's some topics there, but I'm also always happy to come and talk medieval history, or even into more modern time periods as well.
Louisiana Purchase, I'm actually looking for understanding more of it, and definitely trying to understand why did Napoleon decide to do what he did. Obviously, he was short of cash, but
short of cash, and managing colonies is hard.
Right.
So if you can wash your hands of it and get enough money in the bargain to continue moving forward, then why not?
Well, just like what Catherine the Great did, right, with the Alaska, and she and sold it for like very cheap, and now we have an incredible continent with a lot of stuff. So
and Andrew, don't forget to look up Maurice Drouon.
I've got it written down because
he is fantastic, I think. And even though it's supposedly historical fiction, but it's not a fiction at all. All the characters are historical. Maybe like 5% are fictional. That's very rare.
Fantastic. Well, and it sounds like I have a love-hate with historical fiction, because if it's really good historical fiction where the world works in a historical way, I adore it. But the vast majority of historical fiction imposes modern viewpoints on how historical people interact. And I find that so jarring when I hit those moments where that's just not how a person would have thought at that time. But this sounds very much
not. Yeah, he's not like that at all. I mean, I think he really deep understanding.
Yeah, my bugaboo on a lot of historical fiction is it gets turned into an excuse for cinematic romances, which completely alters the person's appreciation. I mean, it's the Gone with the Wind syndrome is what I tend to think of it as. It's like, what do you mean we shouldn't have our wedding on a plantation? It's it tends to skew one's ability to assess the history that one is reading. The history just becomes like a scenic backdrop, and that aggravates me no end. I'm sorry.
Excuse me, could you just spell the name of the author you just mentioned?
It's Druon.
John.
Thank
That's
you.
his last name, and Maurice is the first
name. Is the cultural heritage and history of the Louisiana Purchase area something you feel confident in, Andrew? It's so fascinating and very complex.
I can the as far as relates to Louisiana, no, but in terms of the larger political, social, and economic issues in the United States at that time, absolutely.
Yeah, that's what fascinates me, and I think it's poorly. Again, if you're on the East Coast or probably even the West Coast, you don't really appreciate that. Literally, gumbo is a good word for that area, but I don't think it's easy to appreciate if you're not really aware of how that all got braided together.
Yes.
So that would be something I'd be very interested in if other people were. But thank you so much. This has been
Fantastic.
The more of these seminars I participate in, I get to know people that have similar interests too as well. So it's really fun. Thank you, all of you.
Andrew definitely is a gold mine.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well, this is just a fantastic group. There are so many wonderful, knowledgeable individuals here. The questions are always good. And I really enjoy getting the opportunity.
Thank you. And I hope everybody has a nice day. And today we have another presentation at 7. If you guys are interested in visiting Persepolis, who was the ancient capital of Persia, we're doing a virtual tour today. We're going back in time, and then we'll do a virtual tour of the capital of Persia that started with Cyrus the Great, but the capital had moved from Susa to Persepolis. But so, join us. It'll be very kind of like enjoyable. You don't have to really think, and you'll go through graphic design with the interesting stuff.
Will that be on YouTube, Zach? Will that one go onto YouTube as well?
No, I don't. It's going to be done by my buddy Bachman. We're going to have a lot of collaboration with him, but this one, I will send you his Facebook account later, which is going to be posted there, but not on my YouTube.
Okay, because I had a prior commitment. Otherwise, I would very much have liked to be there, but I was already signed up for something different.
No, I understand. I mean, I apologize. We'll try to, obviously, I try to accommodate. But this one is definitely on YouTube, and I'll send the link to Andrew as well, and to share with with everybody.
It was Darius who moved the capital to Persepolis.
Correct. Right. Well, I'm just saying it was just indifferent, right? Cyrus the Great was the beginner, and then presumably the first true king of proto-democratic to other nationalities, so to speak. But thank you again, and thank you. That was a side note. And then on Monday, if you guys want, we're going to talk about life of Socrates, which is the Greco-Roman philosophy. We've been told, we like philosophy, so we started bringing Jason, who does a lot of Eastern philosophy, the Confucius, Taoism, stuff like that. So he's doing the Western culture, and then if anybody's interested in understanding Ottoman Empire during the World War I, and particularly Armenian genocide, that would be on Thursday, and then and next week we're also going to do Spartacus, whether it's a reality or was it just a made up story, kind of the sound, the list. That's why I was asking about peasantry. And then at the end of the month, if you're interested, we're going to talk about dead languages. And I have a buddy of mine, John, who is a linguist in ancient languages. We'll talk about the Akkadian language, which was from a city of Akkad in Mesopotamia, which is current day Iraq, 3,200 years ago. That language had extinguished, but it used to be lingua franca of the day. So,
not to be confused with American Acadian.
Right.
Or a town in Southern California called Arcadia. I grew up right down the street from there. So.
Yeah, definitely. All right, everybody has a nice evening. Thank you, Andrew, again.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Blessings all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
Good night, everybody.